Alright, YouTube, here's another end-of-the-world prophecy that we can all laugh about once the date comes and goes, and lo and behold, everyone's still here. May 21st of 2011, less than a month away, is claimed to be the date of the Ascension, at which point 20 million Christians will ascend into heaven, and then later, in October of this year, the end of the world is supposed to come. That's according to, I can't remember the name of the group, but it's a small Christian, what you would call group or cult or sect or whatever you want to term it. And basically the people involved arrived at this date using pseudo-numerology, using some sort of weird assumption that 5, 7, and 10 are somehow, symbolically important numbers, and that if you do certain little math with the date of the death of Jesus or something along those lines, that you come up with May 21st, 2011. Besides the fuzzy math involved, we can look back at this Jehovah's Witness-esque dating system and say, lo and behold, the same group claimed the same thing long ago and was wrong, and they used the excuse of, oh, we miscalculated the date. Where have we seen this before? Like I said, the Jehovah's Witnesses have done this dozens of times. You see, every time someone claims a date for the end of the world, it is wrong. It always turns out to be wrong. It's been claimed thousands of times in the last couple of millennia. Indeed, there were many Christians who thought the end of the world had come when the Great Plague swept across Europe. There were many Christians who thought that the end of the world was coming during the San Francisco earthquake. Every time a relatively major disaster crops up, every time a war crops up, every time there's a downturn in society and there's generally somewhat a higher level of poverty and political discourse that is negative, etc. Every time any of these things crops up, somebody thinks it's the end of the world. And they're always wrong. And we've seen this throughout history. If the plague didn't do it, trust me, nothing's going to cause the end of the world to come. Now, of course, as a non-Christian, I don't believe that the world will end on the same basis or in nearly the same time frame that any of these people are claiming. I think, indeed, ironically, the Christian Bible would be correct in saying nobody can know the date, because really, unless scientists see an asteroid hurtling towards Earth at 1,000,000 miles per hour, we're not going to know ahead of time when it's going to happen, because the flu could mutate and wipe out 99% of the population and leave the rest of people to starve to death. Any of 1,000,000 different things could happen. But here's the thing. Looking at all apocalyptic visions from Christianity, we find a common theme. They are all rooted in the revelation of John. What's the problem? There are two problems with Revelations. The first problem is that a great number of people who have studied it have said it should never have been canonized in the first place. That is, that it is not a divinely inspired or even truly Christian writing. The reasoning for this, and I'll get to a second reason in a moment, the main reasoning behind this was, indeed, early Christianity was totally different from modern Christianity, and if you look, there was actually quite a bit of debate at the Council of Nicaea and at other councils that were established relatively early on in Christian tradition. These people wanted to determine, we need to have an actual solid canon for people to read or to be read to by a priest if you're a Catholic. We need a solid canon. How are we going to do this? We need to look at all the books which are claimed to be Christian in nature, divinely inspired, whatever, and say which ones actually make sense given what we believe to be true based on Christian notions. It's a very illogical and flawed system they used. It was a pre-medieval, extremely assumption-based time in human history. They dragged their own socio-political assumptions into which books they decided were to be canonized. But the Revelations of John really were one of the last candidates considered. It was very, very close to being left out of Christian tradition. The reasoning being Number one, it was almost heretical as to the strange things it claimed. Number two, there was no real evidence that it was divinely inspired. Number three, and this comes to the second point of why many Christian scholars and theologians agree that Revelation is really somewhat invalid, is because it appears to have been written symbolically about ancient Rome. 666 adds up to Nero Caesar, who was the reigning emperor, and who was a tyrant. The idea of a money system, the mark of the beast system, was merely a symbolic statement about Caesar's face being on the coinage at the time. And of course we know, looking back, at that time, Christianity was definitely on its last gasp, and the Romans almost eradicated the Christian population at that time. Churches were burned, books were burned, Christians were heavily persecuted. Jews also were persecuted, as well as pagans, but in particular the Christians were heavily persecuted in Rome at that time. There was a great fear among Christians that their religion would not exist. The revelation of John is nothing more than a symbolic statement about the tyranny of Rome, encouraging Christians to take heart in the fact that Rome was going to collapse. And indeed, the general consensus among many people at the time was that Rome was headed for a collapse, because as we see paralleled in our society today, most people understood that the things which Rome was doing at the time were actually symptomatic of its demise. That the tyranny level increasing and that the level of brutality increasing was actually just foreshadowing their downfall, because it was basically meant as nothing more than a distraction from the actual economic issues that were at the heart of the rottenness of the Roman Empire. So it's no small wonder that the book of Revelation was written. Of course Rome was going to fall, and a lot of people who had any knowledge whatsoever knew that that was probably going to happen. So it's small wonder. So Revelation being symbolically written and really not being worthy of canonization in the first place means that all of these Christian groups, which are claiming that the world is going to end at such and such a time, in such and such a place, or whatever, in such and such a way, etc., these groups don't know what they're talking about, because according to Jewish tradition, which is what Christianity is based on in the first place, there is no end of the world. And if Revelation is assumed to be invalid, there will be no apocalypse in Christian tradition. It was only by the inclusion of Revelation and the interpretation of the medieval church of it as a literal, not a figurative doctrine, it is only that which causes modern Christians to believe that there will even be an apocalypse. In reality, there is no literalistic reason to believe that Christian tradition supports the notion of an apocalypse. That's been ingrained socially in Western culture, but it doesn't really make any sense. There's nothing in Revelation that should be taken literally. It was meant to be taken symbolically. So divorcing literalism from Revelation, nowhere else in the Bible does it say, oh, the world's going to pass away, and God's going to send Jesus back with a sword. And yes, there will be hell on earth, and then there'll be, all kingdom of heaven will descend out of the sky, and so forth. These things were written symbolically, in a symbolic manner, in a mathematical manner in some cases. Why do you think there was such a focus on the mathematical proportions of the new heaven? It's probably some numerological connection that people just don't understand. But, again, Christian tradition, divorced from Revelation, which was questionable in canonization in the first place, doesn't have an apocalypse. Judaism doesn't have an apocalypse. If Judaism, the basis for the Christian religion, doesn't have an apocalypse, why would the Christians think there would be an apocalypse, except this wrongly canonized text? Also, you can look elsewhere in the Bible. I mean, you can look in there and say, it's going to come like a thief in the night, nobody's going to know when it will happen. Now, you can say this was a symbolic statement about nobody knowing exactly when Rome was going to fall, or you can drag it into the modern text, into the modern context, and say, if the revelation of John indeed is meant to be taken literally, and there will be an apocalypse, It also states right in there that nobody's going to know when it's going to happen, so why bother putting a date? So on May 22nd, 2011, I will be laughing because the world won't have ended. And it will be funny to me, because once again, as with every other prediction ever made by a Christian group about the end of the world, and there have been thousands of them, it will be wrong. And it will be hysterical, because these people have wasted tens of thousands of dollars on advertising, they've wasted entire years of their life, and it just goes to show that the whole sky is falling, crying out to the masses, and waving a cardboard sign, the end is nigh, doesn't really help anybody and is utterly and completely stupid. If these people wanted something to focus on, they should be focusing on, ending poverty, or curing AIDS, or doing something good for their fellow man. But apparently these aren't good acts Christians. These are believe in a specific sect Christians, which are even more insidious.